Hi, everyone. Um, Thanks for being here. Thanks for calling in. I know that we're all getting pretty good at pretending that we're somewhere other than our living rooms. So do that now and imagine that you're standing on the coast of Maine, looking out at the wide Atlantic. The cool ocean breeze is coming in and the waves are crashing on the sand. And then in your mind's eye, turn around. What do you see? Well, it's likely that you'd see a salt marsh. Salt marshes are often overshadowed by sandy beaches, but these are really the heroes of our coastline, these estuarine communities that cushion land from open ocean. And so I thought a good time to introduce you all to Maine's salt marshes would be at high tide. Because at high tide, you can really get a sense of how these places are the mangrove swamps of the north. They're dominated by grasses in the genus Spartina that are adapted to being completely inundated twice every day by tidal flooding. And so if you were standing here at the edge of the sea, you might notice this kind of table of peat. And this is what I'm going to refer to in this talk as the marsh platform. This is the foundation of the salt marsh, a dense blanket of peat made up of sediment and the roots of Spartina. So when I started this project in partnership with the state of Maine, I really had two big questions. The first was, what are the metrics that we should use when we are assessing salt marsh condition? Knowing that the state of Maine wanted metrics that were rapid, in other words, a site could be completed in a single day, quantitative, and of course, metrics that were ecologically and statistically meaningful. My second question was, well, what is the status of Maine's salt marshes? How are they doing? I really wanted to take a pulse check of these places and then report back on their condition. And so today I'm going to tell you about a couple of metrics that I piloted as part of this project. Before I jump into the methods and results of that work, I just want to give a little bit more background on salt marshes, lest you think that they're just a sea of Spartina grass. There is a smattering of other salt-tolerant forbs in here. Some of the key players, starting up on the top left, are sea milkwort, or glaucs, sea kale, atriplex, glasswort, salicornia, sea plantain, seaside goldenrod, sea lavender or limonium, and the pink flowers of seaside gerardia, which is rare in Maine, Agellinus meridima. So there are a couple more, but not many. Not many plants can hack it out there. And the vegetation in these marshes tends to form distinct zones according to tidal inundation, with areas of low marsh forming in places that are flooded every day by the tide. You've seen that dominated by Spartina alterniflora, and then high marsh forming in kind of the drier areas that are flooded only by the highest tides. These places are dominated by another species of Spartina patens, commonly known as salt hay, because historically it was harvested as hay for livestock. But the thing that I really want to show you here is what I think is the defining process of a salt marsh, and that is this remarkable ability for a marsh to maintain equilibrium with the mean high tide line. What do I mean by that? Well, for the past several thousands of years, sea level rise has been increasing by something like 1.5 millimeters per year. Not very much, but as this happens, salt marshes accrete sediment and build up their rhizomes so that marsh platforms actually build and keep up with rising seas. And so in this way, for thousands of years, marshes have been maintaining themselves and essentially rescuing themselves from drowning. Now, I hate to add more bad news onto the 2020 onslaught, but you probably saw this coming anyway, but sea level rise is accelerating. New England is known as a sea level rise hotspot, where the rise is happening at a rate that's 3 to 4 times greater than the worldwide average. So concern here is that if marshes can't keep up with this rate of sea level rise, they'll likely drown. Why am I telling you this? Well, knowing that the fate of salt marshes is so dependent on these foundations of peat, in this project, I really wanted to look at metrics that would tell us something about the condition of these marsh platforms. This was particularly important because these beautiful swales of high marsh are increasingly looking more and more like this. On the left, these big expanses of shallow standing water with kind of disintegrating hummocks of peat. And then on the right, areas of dead Spartina patens turning into open mudflat or being taken over by this little spiky, this is the stunted form of Spartina alterniflora. So, we assume that when these areas become unvegetated like this, they will lose their integrity of their peat and kind of slump and subside. But few studies have looked at how to measure this. And so with that in mind, I chose 3 peat-centric metrics to focus on in this project. And now I'm going to tell you about 2 of them. The density of ditching in marshes. These have been dug pretty much since European colonists set foot on the shore, and also later on for mosquito control. The second metric is soil bearing capacity, which is essentially a measure of soil strength. You can imagine stepping on this mucky spot, you'd sink right into it, and those areas have lower bearing capacity than a nice firm marsh platform over here. So I took these on the road to pilot these metrics on a spread of marshes across the coast of Maine. And because I wanted this to be the beginning of a reference catalog of condition statewide, I chose marshes with varying levels of disturbance. Disturbance meaning things like tidal restriction by roads and culverts that were too small, land use like diking, ditching, filling, and quality of the buffer around the marsh. A good place to start with my metrics was digitizing the ditches in all of my marsh sites. So you can see that using aerial imagery, it's pretty easy to pick up on the linear man-made features in these marshes. These ditches were probably dug in the 1930s by CCC workers who were trying to drain the marsh pools and all the habitat for the salt marsh mosquito. It didn't work, but that's a different story. So having digitized these, I was able to calculate the density of ditching in each of my sites in meters per hectare. And I then lumped the marshes into 3 categories, high, medium, and low, for easy scoring. I found that most of my marshes had been ditched, 16 out of the 24 sites. And this might seem like a lot, but actually I thought that this was pretty good because studies have shown that in New England, over 90% of our salt marshes have been ditched. So in fact, we're pretty lucky in Maine to have any marshes that were not ditched. My second metric, I took out into the field and I wanted to test soil bearing capacity using a tool called a soil penetrometer. And this tool is one that I designed based on a paper by Truhig and Stolt in Rhode Island. And they did a study that showed that this metric, bearing capacity, was really meaningful in illustrating degradation by tidal restriction in Rhode Island marshes. However, it hadn't been used in Maine, and so I wasn't sure if this metric would transfer. But we had one built, and here it is. It's pretty much a glorified slide hammer that you place on the marsh surface and slam this weight down. And I did this along 2 transects at each site, placing these transects in areas representative of the marsh's vegetation from Tidal Creek to upland, and then taking 2 measures of bearing capacity at each 10-meter interval. First, I measured loading response, which was simply placing the penetrometer on the surface of the marsh for 5 seconds, and then seeing how far it sank into the peat. It was about 13 pounds. The second measure was penetration depth, to kind of look at the deeper layers of peat. And so there I dropped the weight 10 times on the penetrometer and recorded that penetration depth in centimeters. And we did time this sampling so that ideally I would start right at low tide and be finished within 2 hours of low tide. So, and here, actually, I wanted to point out another vegetation zone. Here we're sampling in another kind of area of high marsh, but this is dominated by Juncus gerardii, or black rush. So how would I validate this metric? Well, I needed an independent measure of marsh integrity. And luckily, I had ditch density to use. And so to validate this metric, I wanted to see if there was a relationship between penetration depth and ditch density. And it looks like there is a relationship there, with penetration depth increasing as ditch density increases, and each of these points being one of my 24 sites. This wasn't really surprising, knowing that marshes that are heavily ditched tends to lower the water table and cause increased decomposition and then subsidence of the soils. Another way that I wanted to validate this metric was to compare, look at the relationship between penetration depth and a general condition score for each of my sites. And so here you'll see this EIA score is an ecological integrity assessment score that is used by the state and ranges from 0, very poor, to 4, excellent. So a number of quantitative and qualitative metrics go into that, the rolling up of that score, but it's a pretty good measure of overall condition. And so again, there seems to be a relationship between mean penetration depth in these sites and overall score. So next I wanted to look at bearing capacity, this metric, and see if it could pick up on differences in the soils in a single marsh that was partially restricted from the tides. This marsh in Machias was a really good site for this, because you can see that this railroad bed running west to east through the site has really cut off that northern part of the marsh from the tides. Where my cursor is, there is a little tide gate that it is kind of leaky. I think it's actually propped open by a rock. So the tides do partially get in, but you can see this horrible looking area is a really subsided area of marsh. Studies of the site have shown that it's subsided about 1.5 feet. It's really kind of mucky and unvegetated. So I thought that penetration depth would likely be a lot deeper here than in the unrestricted unit. So using the same 2 transects in each unit, a t-test showed that this was in fact true. In the restricted area of the marsh, penetration depths were much, much higher. You can see that part of the marsh here. It's really kind of sad looking with just some salicornia and algae. And so we had a mean of 4.5 centimeters, and our readings from this restricted area of marsh were the highest that I had across the coast. I wanted to do the same paired study in a marsh with really heavily ditched areas and some areas that were unditched. So I went down to Scarborough Marsh, largest marsh in Maine, and again ran 2 transects in an area that was heavily ditched up here in blue, and then relatively unditched in yellow. And again, the ditched area showed a higher mean penetration depth than the unditched unit. And of course, this is just one marsh, and there are likely other things going on. For example, there's this road that cuts right through the marsh, but as a preliminary result, kind of suggests that this metric can pick up on differences caused by ditching in a single marsh. And one last result of this metric that I want to share is not really about marsh health, but one that I think is interesting. You've now seen a number of these different vegetation zones that make up the marsh mosaic. The high marsh and Juncus Girardii areas being kind of drier and higher up than the low marsh. And so here we're looking at penetration depth across all 24 sites in different vegetation zones. And so it's not really a surprise that the low marsh exhibited higher penetration depth readings. It's kind of muckier and more wet down there, less dense rhizomatous masses here. But what I think is really interesting here is this purple box. So this vegetation zone is Spartina alterniflora high marsh, that area that's being taken over by the stunted form of Spartina alterniflora. And what's interesting here is that a lot of these areas are former high marsh that are transitioning into areas that are taken over by this stunted grass. And so I think that there is some promise here that maybe this tool could be used to monitor marsh peat and see if bearing capacity is changing over time as our marshes respond to rising seas. So conclusions of this work are that soil bearing capacity and ditch density are two metrics that are useful. They're both rapid and quantitative and seemingly meaningful, telling the story of peat condition in Maine marshes. This metric, soil bearing capacity, can be used to pick up differences in soil degradation that may be caused by ditching and tidal restriction. And lastly, I think that the big picture goal of this work is really to use assessment methods as tools to identify conservation and restoration needs in places that are critical but very vulnerable. And so hopefully assessing the condition of these peat platforms is a step towards figuring out how to give these salt marshes a fighting chance in keeping pace with rising seas. I will end there, and I want to thank Maine Natural Areas Program for sponsoring this work, especially my fantastic sponsor, Kristen Puryear. Thanks to Bev Johnson and Phil Dosty, who actually made the soil penetrometer. Couldn't have done it without them. And I want to thank my advisor, Kathy, and the rest of my committee, Liz, Jeff, and Dave, Morgan Southgate for helping with data analysis, and the rest of my FN cohort. And with that, I will leave you with flowering high marsh and happily take any questions.